We are the changemakers, right? And it's actually a good thing, because wouldn't you agree the world is in need of a little bit of change right now? In fact, sometimes it feels like everything is changing. So what kind of change maker do you want to be? What kind of change do you want to make in the world? Do you want to be the kind of person who makes life better for yourself and for those around you? Do you want to be the kind of person who makes meaningful, lasting change? Do you want to be the kind of person that looks at an empty field and sees the potential for beauty? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. So I'd like you all to join me in imagining a time where technology is changing the way people communicate, where suddenly it's possible to communicate with more people, with more accuracy, in more ways than ever before. Can you imagine that time? I want you to imagine a time where the spirit of technology leads to inventions, where people are inventing devices that allow us to know ourselves and the world around us in new and exciting ways, where people are able to understand the way their bodies work, how they can be healthier, how they can heal what's wrong, and understand the way the world works around them, even to the point of understanding and predicting nature. And I want you to imagine a time of exploration, where there's no corner too far to get to. And even if we can't quite get there yet, people believe they will. Can you imagine such a time? All right, I can see you well enough to know that you're smiling and nodding at me, sort of knowingly, yes, yes, she's talking about the modern days, but no, I'm talking about the early modern period. That's the time when our lives today really began. This is the beginning of modern commerce, of modern economics, of modern science and modern medicine. This is the beginning of modern communication and even modern espionage. The early modern period was a time where technology changed the way people communicate. The technology of the printing press was a watershed moment in the human experience. Suddenly, you were able not to have to copy by hand each letter or paper you wanted to send. You could have an idea and have it printed over and over and over again and distribute it widely. And as there began to be more printed documents, the literacy rate rose exponentially. There was more to read, so more people learned to read. And the more people learned to read, the more they printed so they could read. It changed everything. There were also inventions that allowed people to understand their bodies, themselves, and the world around them. Now, our medicine is quite different than medicine in the early modern period, but it really did begin then, that they began to invent instruments to monitor the body, to figure out what was wrong and needed healing, so that people were able to be healthier. And inventions, something we take for granted, the clock, but imagine what it was like where suddenly you were able to track time. Everyone could agree on what time it was. This clock also tracks the days of the year, the months of the year, and very importantly, begins to monitor the phases of the moon and the resultant change in tide. If you lived in London during the early modern days, your main means of transportation would not be the road, it would be the river. The River Thames that runs through London was the most reliable, the safest way to travel, except for those pesky tides. If you knew when the tides were up and down, you could navigate the world more successfully. It was a time of exploration, and I want you to imagine the Golden Hind not on a London street, but in the middle of the ocean, where there was no corner of the world that was suddenly off limits, where people went further, and what they could see in front of them was not all there was. People were exploring and discovering new lands, new plants, new animals, new food sources. Think of the difference that would make. Even new people. Now, one thing that happens with all of that new exploration, discovery, invention, is there really aren't ways to share all those ideas. There aren't even words to describe them. And that's where Shakespeare comes in. In a time where everything is changing, Shakespeare did more with language than anyone has before or since. For one thing, he started with words. He gathered words from all kinds of lost sources. He put them together. He changed them. When he needed to, he invented them. He created words that we still use today and that allowed people in the early modern period to explore all the changes that were around them. He also captured the essence of the human experience that was changing through his plays. He wrote about exploration. He wrote about the creation of a different kind of family and a different kind of power. He wrote about how to heal people in different ways. Shakespeare created worlds out of words that defined the human experience and that still inform us more than 400 years later. Shakespeare was a changemaker. And he teaches us some ways that we can make the kind of meaningful, lasting change that he did. So I'd like to explore 3 ways. The first, he teaches us to ask true, sometimes painfully true questions. When Juliet asks, "What's in a name?" she thinks it's a fairly simple question. She's a Capulet, Romeo's a Montague. That's the reason they can't be together. So if they can simply give away their names, everything will be fine. That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. But what Juliet discovers, tragically through the course of the play, is that what's in a name includes suspicion, anger, hatred, and violence. Today, when our civil discourse has deteriorated into name-calling and labeling those we don't agree with, when people are tempted to dehumanize others by making them less than a person, we have to remember that what's in a name can include suspicion, anger, hatred, and violence. Shakespeare demands we consider these kinds of questions. He also points out questions that don't work. In the beginning of King Lear goes to his daughters and asks a false question. "Which of you, shall we say, doth love us most?" And then his daughters begin to sort of, 2 of them at least, tell him what he wants to hear. Lear is turning relationship into a transaction. Tell me what I want to hear, and in return I'll give you land and money and power. When the transaction's over, the 2 daughters have told him what he wants to hear, and he's given them land, money, and power. They're finished. They go off. And Lear begins to realize that's not quite what I wanted to happen. So he surrounds himself with 100 soldiers because he still needs someone outside of himself to make him feel good and powerful and worthy. So he walks around with these 100 soldiers. And you know, the daughters, who are sort of done, don't really want to take care of these 100 soldiers. They don't want to clothe them. They don't want to feed them. They don't want to house them. And so they say to him, "Why do you need 100 soldiers? You don't need that many people. You're not really doing anything anymore. Why do you need even 50 soldiers? Why do you need even 10? And then the daughters manage to ask Lear the true, painful question, "What need one?" It is only when all of the external sources of value are stripped away from Lear that he is able to see himself and the world around him with clarity. In our lives, we need to be the kind of people who carry our worth and value with us and don't rely on everybody else. Shakespeare teaches us to ask these kinds of questions. The second thing Shakespeare does is he reminds us that the world and people are messy and complicated, but you still need to pay attention. Hamlet is one of Shakespeare's most famous plays. In fact, even young school children can recite the line "to be or not to be." That is the question. They don't really know what it means. They know it's something about carrying a skull. We think we know Hamlet, but actually when we look closely, we see that Hamlet is sort of a messy, complicated play about messy, complicated people. There's Hamlet. He's so devastated by the loss of his father, he can barely function. And yet, without much thought, and certainly no regret, he kills Polonius and then blames Laertes, Polonius' son, for mourning the death of his father, the same thing he's been doing. That's pretty messy and complicated. We have the ghost of Hamlet's father who comes to his son, and wouldn't you think a father coming to a son in mourning would give him comfort or encouragement? Oh, no, no, not this ghost. He comes right up and says, "Avenge my foul and most unnatural murder." Hamlet's doomed from that point on. There are no good outcomes from Hamlet. And then we have Ophelia, the only truly innocent character in the play who never tries to hurt anyone. But it's Ophelia people aren't sure really deserves a Christian burial. So Hamlet's messy and complicated, and the problem is people become so distracted by all of that complication, they don't see the corruption creeping in until we have something really rotten in the state of Denmark, and in fact, a stage littered with corpses. In our lives, it's probably not quite that dramatic, but we can get distracted by the messiness and complication and forget to pay attention and do our part to make things better. The third thing Shakespeare reminds us, is the power and beauty of great language. Shakespeare used language in ways that no one ever has. He created stories that have lasted and informed our lives for years. He explores the totality of the human condition, from the very personal to the completely political. He explores families and dynasties, nations and enemies. He explores everything through language. Shakespeare teaches us to speak the speech. He explores the winter of our discontent and the glorious summer that follows. He asks us to lend him our ears and then shows us how to ask other people to lend us theirs. He warns that uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. And he reminds us and demonstrates to us that all the world's a stage. And because of that, we have the ability to change the scene, to change the players, and to change the script. We have the ability to use powerful language to create the new reality that we want. So if you want to make meaningful, lasting change, ask the true, sometimes painful questions that really demand an answer. Remember that yes, life and people are messy and complicated, but we still need to pay attention. We still need to do our part. And use powerful language that has the ability to create worlds out of words that bring happiness, beauty, joy, opportunities to yourself and those around you. Worlds that solve problems and build communities. So if you want to be that kind of a change maker, start with Shakespeare. Thank you.